So this is the new Forerunner 570 from Garmin, and this multi-sport watch sits in an interesting place in Garmin's lineup of Forerunner watches, in between their entry-level Forerunner 165 and their flagship Forerunner 970. And it kind of has a tough job sitting right there in the middle, where it needs to deliver compelling enough health, sports, and smartwatch features for someone to plunk down more money than the 165, but also keep the price low enough for those of us who may not need every single feature of their flagship 970. Did they do that? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in today's video. So the first thing to know about this is that Forerunner name may be a little bit misleading. This is much more than just a running watch. This is actually a full-featured multi-sport watch that can be used for all kinds of sports and activities. It's just that that Forerunner name is what Garmin's used for this lineup of sports-focused watches for decades, so it's just kind of like a familiar name they like to use. And the 570 is Garmin's new mid-range Forerunner, and I use quotes around the term mid-range because I think they've sort of redefined what mid-range actually means, at least in their lineup of watches. And the 570 is meant to replace their long-standing and quite popular Forerunner 265. And the most obvious question there may be, why didn't they just call this the Forerunner 270? And their reasoning for that is that they've added much more to this watch versus what the 265 originally had, and it kind of deserved a new name with a higher number. And the numbering scheme actually does make sense now, where 5 sits right there in the middle of 1 and 9. But where this kind of gets tricky though is whether or not this watch is actually mid-range anymore, or if it's actually much more than that. Alright, so first up, let's talk about price. And the Forerunner 570 comes in at $549 versus the 265, which was originally $449 when it first came out. So let's talk about what they've added for that extra $100. So the first area where they made a pretty big upgrade is the materials, where the 570 sports a new aluminum bezel versus the all-plastic construction of the 265. And visually, this definitely elevates the 570 in terms of looks, where it certainly looks a lot more premium. And then there's also two different sizes that you can choose from. So they have a 47mm model as well as a 42mm model. And here's how both of them look on my 185mm circumference wrist, as well as a smaller wrist, just so you can kind of get an idea of which size may be right for you. And in terms of durability, so the aluminum bezel looks to have held up pretty well over the last couple months for me, and I can't really see any scratches or anything like that. And the same thing can probably be said about the Gorilla Glass lens, where that looks to be good to go as well. And I'm kind of careless with my watches, where I kind of like bang them up against walls and corners and stuff like that, but it looks still to be good to go. And to get around the 570, so this uses a combination of buttons along with a touchscreen. And the nice thing about this combination is that you have the touchscreen when that's convenient for you, like let's say scrolling through menus and more just like general smartwatch use, but then you have the buttons when using a touchscreen isn't as convenient. And where that can really come into play is going to be more like sports scenarios where our hands may be sweaty, or we actually may have gloves on too, where using a touchscreen is kind of challenging in both those scenarios. Now, having a touchscreen is super handy, but there also can be times where water or sweat can cause accidental touches or swipes, and they actually have a couple ways of preventing this, where you can turn off the touchscreen if you'd like, and then you can also lock the device entirely. And the difference here is that turning off the touchscreen just disables touch, but locking the device also locks the buttons as well. And what I find to be really helpful with these functions is that if you want to access them really quickly, you can actually set these up as button shortcuts in the settings, where you can assign different functions to different key combinations when you long press and hold. And there's a host of different things that you can assign to these different key combos. But there's even one more way that they've come up with to prevent accidental touches, and this is something that I definitely use, and that's their touch lock feature, which I find to be even more convenient than the other two ways that I just talked about, where if you use this feature, the touchscreen is always locked when you're not interacting with the device. And what you'll notice is this little lock icon if you try to touch the screen. And all you have to do to unlock it is just swipe down on the lock icon and the screen unlocks. And then when you're done interacting with the watch, the touchscreen just kind of locks again. And you'll access this feature, by the way, by going into the settings, then display and brightness, and then all the way down to the touch lock feature. Oh, and really quick, if you're finding the information in this video to be useful, do me a quick favor and just hit that like button down below. It's a small thing that you can do that'll help this video and the channel out quite a bit, and I appreciate it. And then on the display side of things, so Garmin tossed in a new super bright display panel here, and this was kind of interesting decision because it's not like the display on the 265 was bad or anything like that. I mean, I had zero complaints about it, but if you look at these side by side, the new display on the 570 is way brighter. And Garmin doesn't usually publish actual brightness levels like nits or anything like that, but this thing is crazy bright. And in fact, I actually use the display at the lowest brightness level, and I still find that setting to be plenty bright. And this is actually where I would love to see more brightness level options here other than just the 3 levels. And more importantly, importantly, a lower brightness level than what they have, which would use less power and also allow us to get more battery life, which we'll talk about in just one bit. And when it comes to smartwatch features, so this again is where they made some pretty big upgrades over the previous generation 265. So with the 570, you'll get notifications just like before with the 265, whether you're on an Android phone or an iPhone. And then again, just like before, you can also reply to messages if you're on an Android phone, but unfortunately you won't be able to reply if you're on an iPhone. So Apple locks down reply functionality with iMessage to just Apple Watches, and other companies can't directly tap into that. However, the 570 has a little bit of a workaround there where since the 570 has a built-in microphone, it also has a voice assistant function where you can access Siri from your phone. And with this, you can actually reply using the voice assistant function. So while you're not able to directly reply using an on-screen keyboard like you can do if you're on an Android phone, you actually sort of can reply with a 570 if you're on an iPhone using voice. And the same thing can be said, by the way, if you're on an Android phone. You'll still have the ability to reply using Google Assistant in addition to the predefined responses, as well as an on-screen keyboard. And this probably brings us to one of the biggest additions on the smartwatch functionality side of things versus the 265, where the 570 has both a built-in microphone as well as a full-blown speaker. And for the speaker portion of it, so this is where you'll get nicer tones all around depending on whatever you're doing on the watch.
Lap 1, 4 seconds.
Versus just kind of like the normal beeps that you get from the 265. But since this has both a microphone as well as a speaker, you'll also be able to take calls on the watch itself as long as your phone is in Bluetooth range. But the speaker and microphone actually go beyond just nicer tones and taking calls. So there's also a voice command feature here. So this allows you to actually control different functions on your watch. Like you can actually set timers and alarms. You can access settings that you may be kind of like buried deep in the menus. And you can even start an activity if you'd like. Start a trail run. And then when it comes to battery life, so this is really going to depend on how you use your watch as well as the settings that you choose to use. So for the larger 47mm model, if you're using the always-on display mode, they advertise up to around 5.5 days of battery life. And if you're not using the always-on display mode, you may get upwards of 11 days out of it. And then with a smaller 42mm model, that drops it down to 4.5 days if you're using the always-on display mode, and then 10 days if you turn that off. And there's also some other factors that contribute to battery life, such as some additional display settings like the brightness level, as well as how much time you spend recording outdoor activities. And for me, I've been using the 47mm model with the always on display mode, again at the lowest brightness setting, and then I also use the SpO2 sensor during sleep. And I've been getting anywhere from like 3.5 to 5 days out of it before I have to recharge it. And that 3.5 day mark is when I'm spending more time outdoors, but with that 5 day mark, that's going to be more where if you're going to be recording more indoor activities. And when it comes specifically for battery life for recording outdoor activities, so they advertise anywhere from like 14 to 18 hours of battery life, depending on your setting, if you're not using music playback. And for my test, so I was using their Sat IQ or auto select mode, and it was consistently exceeding their 16-hour claim for that mode. Now, battery life is actually an area where it's a step back from the previous generation 265, where at least for general day-to-day battery life, the 265 was a smidge higher in most scenarios. But the compromise that was made here is that the 570 now has a brighter display, which requires more power, and they also had to make room for the microphone and speaker, which reduced the amount of space that they could use for the battery. So now let's get into the activity and health tracking side of things. So the 570 can track your steps. It can also track your floors climbed throughout the day since it does have an altimeter. It tracks your heart rate 24 hours a day, including tracking your resting heart rate. It will calculate your calories burned. There's also blood oxygen saturation tracking. It also has Garmin's body battery metric, which gives you an indication of your current energy level based on your sleep as well as your activity level. And it'll even give you a breakdown of how certain events throughout your day have either charged or drained your body battery. And then it also tracks your sleep, and it'll give you a sleep score along with tracking your sleep stages. There's also Garmin's new breathing variations feature, which may be able to give you clues on any breathing disturbances that you may experience throughout the night. And then it'll also track your recovery time. So this is based on all your previous activity as well as how well you've recovered through sleep. And then also tracks your HRV or heart rate variability over time. And this can also be a great indicator of how well you're recovering. But I've actually also found HRV to give me clues on when I may be getting sick. So on the health tracking side of things, the 570 has much more than their entry-level 165 and nearly everything that comes on their 970 as well. But the 970 does have one advantage here. So the 570 and 970 both have Garmin's 5th generation heart rate sensor, which is their most accurate yet, but the 970 has additional hardware that allows it to have ECG capabilities. Now, when it comes to what kinds of sports that you can track with the 570, so this is a pretty big upgrade from the previous generation 265, and also may be a reason to opt for this versus the entry-level 165, where this can track everything from running to cycling to swimming, as well as plenty of gym profiles. There's outdoor recreation profiles, there's racket sports, and even team sports. And I think some highlights here over the entry-level 165 are going to be open water swimming in addition to pool swimming. There's also multi-sport modes for triathlon and duathlon events, a lot more on the cycling end of things as well, with some specific profiles for more kinds of riding, and quite a bit more on the outdoor recreation side of things like water sports and snow sports. So before we get into training feedback, let's first talk about accuracy. So let's first talk about GPS accuracy, and this kind of splits into two different areas: the finer detail the GPS tracks and then the total distance that's collected. And for distance, that's very close to all the devices I was using, and we're talking about lots and lots of activities here. And then for the finer detail of the GPS tracks themselves, absolutely zero issues here when it comes to the tracks. Super solid in all the straight sections with like no wavering, and nice and tight on all the corners and curves. Even with the high-speed corners where we can sometimes see devices overshoot or kind of go off course. Good stuff all around. And by the way, I was using their Sat IQ or auto select mode for all my tests, and what this does is that it intelligently and automatically switches between different satellite modes based on how strong a satellite signal it has at a given point in time. So if you're like riding out in a wide open section, it uses a lower power mode, and then if you get into some trees or around some tall objects that may interfere with a clear view of the sky, you can switch to a higher accuracy dual band mode. And this is the mode I use on all my Garmin's, by the way, and I find it provides the best balance of accuracy and battery life. And then when it comes to altimeter accuracy, pretty good here overall as well. And you'll never see every single device line up exactly, but as long as each are kind of like relatively close to each other, as well as a reference point, which for me, I use Strava's corrected elevation figure just as a baseline, then there's really not going to be any issues here. And then when it comes to heart rate accuracy, so the 570 gets Garmin's latest 5th generation heart rate sensor, and this sensor does a pretty good job for me for the activities that I do. So for baseline, I usually start out with indoor cycling, which is generally a pretty easy activity for most heart rate sensors to get right, and the 570 did a really good job here and produced some solid results. But taking it outside, so this is where we start to throw more variables into the mix, like bumps and vibrations in the road, and this is where you can see heart rate accuracy drift a bit, but the 570 actually did a really good job on nearly all my rides. But I did have one ride early on in my testing where things were a little bit wonky, so I'm not really sure if that was like an early software thing or something else that was going on, because the rest of my rides since have actually been pretty much perfect. And then when it comes to running, so pretty good here as well, where really no big misses or anything like that. Although on this run, it did read a smidge high for a few minutes here and here, but nothing really way out of line or anything like that. Now, when it comes to high intensity interval training as well as weight training, so these are basically the hardest kinds of activities for wrist-based optical heart rate sensors to get right. And it's just the nature of these activities where there's a lot of gripping and varying arm movement, which these kinds of sensors really don't like. And for high intensity interval training, it did okay for the most part, but you will see a little bit of a high reading here and then a little bit of a dip here, although the rest of the workout was actually pretty good. And then for this workout here, again, a little bit off here or there, but I'd still say pretty meaningful results overall. But when it comes to weight training though, so what I found is that it really can depend on what kind of specific movement that you're doing. Like you can see on some of these sets that's actually pretty good, but then on others like these bicep curls here, it kind of wandered. But then on these shoulder flies, it did really well, as well as the high intensity intervals at the end. And then when it comes to training feedback that the 570 can provide, so the 570 comes with quite a bit actually, and it's quite similar to what you get on the higher end 970. So first off, when it comes to running, so it can provide your running VO2 max, your lactate threshold, as well as your race time predictor for times that you could potentially achieve based on your running history. And you'll also be able to see how this trends over the last 4 weeks of training. And to get this running VO2 max estimate, by the way, so this requires you to run outdoors for at least 10 minutes, and then your heart rate needs to be at least 70% of your max heart rate for more than 10 minutes. But the most important thing here is that you do need to run outdoors with this. This doesn't work on the treadmill. And then it can also estimate your cycling VO2 max, as well as automatically estimate your FTP or functional threshold power, or basically the amount of theoretical power that you could potentially sustain over an hour of riding. And this is basically a very widely used gauge on your cycling performance. And with cycling VO2 max, so you can do this either indoors or outdoors, but you will need a cycling power meter to get cycling VO2 max. And then beyond that, there's also broader training feedback. And the first thing is going to be called training status. And this can be anywhere from peaking or productive, as in the volume and variety of training that you've been doing has been positively contributing to your performance, all the way down to unproductive or overreaching, as in you actually may be training too much, or the kinds of training that you've been doing isn't making a positive impact. And this is based on multiple factors, including your acute training load, which is basically comparing the last 7 days of exercise load to the last 28 days of exercise load. Your load focus, so this is how much time you're spending at different training intensities, whether that's anaerobic, high aerobic, or low aerobic zones. And basically the optimum here is to have a nice balance of all three zones. And as you can see for me, I need to definitely buckle up and do a little bit more on the anaerobic side of things. It also takes takes your VO2 max history into this equation, and it also factors in your heart rate variability or HRV status to make sure that's balanced and in range. Recovery time is also factored in here, and then it also tracks your heat acclimation, as in how well your body's handling heat during training, as well as altitude acclimation, as in the altitude in which your body's actually adapted to. And then on top of that, there's also Garmin's training readiness feature, and how this is different from training status is that training readiness is all about how primed or ready you are for training at a given point in time. And this is based on both your training history as well as your recovery. So this is looking at your last night's sleep quality, your current recovery time from previous training, your HRV status, your acute training load, your sleep history over the last 7 days, as well as your stress history from the last 7 days. And the difference here is that training status is more about how your recent training has been positively or negatively contributing to your performance. So basically looking back at your training, where training readiness is more looking forward, as in how ready you are for your workout at a given point in time. So the 570 is definitely packed with quite a few features here, but we should also talk about what doesn't come in the 570, which does come on the 970. So like we talked about earlier, even though the 570 and the 970 both come with Garmin's 5th generation heart rate sensor, the 570 doesn't have the additional hardware that's needed for those ECG capabilities. And another thing that you get with the 970, which doesn't come in the 570, is offline maps, where it not only adds context to your location where you can see roads, trails, and other landmarks around you, but you can also actually use it to do on-demand routing, where you can actually choose a location on a map or even search points of interest where it actually give you directions to that location. Now, even though the 570 doesn't have offline maps, it still does have breadcrumb style routing, where you can see the path that you've taken during your activity, and you can also use a back to start feature to get you back to your start location. And it also does support route navigation, where you can actually load in routes from Garmin Connect and other sources, where it can give you turn-by-turn directions for your activity. And the last big ticket item that you will get on the 970 that doesn't come on the 570 is the built-in flashlight right here. And to be honest, this is a feature that I use on a daily basis when I'm wearing a watch that has this feature. It just comes in incredibly handy in tons of situations, and it has been something that I've missed while using the 570. And while we're on the topic of flashlights, that's also something that you'll get with the recent Venue 4, which does come with that feature, but the Venue 4 doesn't come with the 5-button configuration of the 570, so it's not going to be as sports focused in that regard. And that brings us full circle to where this watch actually sits in Garmin's lineup, and the 570 is in an interesting position considering the price. In terms of features, I think this does hit the sweet spot with what a lot of people may be looking for with a full-on multi-sport watch, with the ability to track nearly everything under the sun, and comes with all the training feedback that pretty much anyone could need. So I think it's positioned nicely in terms of features with Garmin's current Forerunner lineup. However, when it comes to price, that's where it doesn't make as much sense, where this is $300 more than the 165, but then $200 less than the 970. And with the 970, there's 3 big features that you get for that extra $200: the flashlight, the full offline maps, as well as ECG. But making this a little bit more awkward is the recent Venue 4, which is the same price as the 570, at least right now, but then this also has ECG as well as the flashlight, but doesn't have the convenience of the additional buttons. So in terms of being middle of the road and offering a feature set that most people may need, I think this definitely hits the mark, but the $550 price tag doesn't necessarily scream mid-range to me. That's getting into more like premium territory. So I think the 570 would be in a really good position if it was like $50 less, but realistically like $100 less at $449, which would make a lot more sense in Garmin's lineup of watches. The good news is it's now about 6 months since it came out, at least at the time of this filming, so hopefully we'll see this come down in price, especially around the holidays, and at $449 or even $499, I think it's a great watch. Anyhow, those are my long-term thoughts on the Forerunner 570, and I'm going to have a follow-up review on the Venue 4 that's coming up soon, where I'll have some in-depth comparisons to this watch, so make sure to subscribe to the channel to get a notification when that video comes out. And if you found the information in this video to be useful, just do me a favor and hit that like button down below, and in the meantime, have fun out there, and we will see you in the next video.